So I want to start with something that you wrote very recently about what the Texas power grid crisis could be emblematic of in terms of feel-good energy policies that progressives like to tout. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Oh, certainly. I mean, I've talked to enough environmentalists over the years in various roles that I've had to know that they have this vision that they put out there, that the entire power grid can be operated off renewable energy. And they even narrow it further than that. They say wind and solar, essentially to the exclusion of all others. And then you layer on top of that, that not only do they want to power 100% of our electricity needs, they also want to electrify our transportation so that everybody's driving an electric car and plugging it in. And they also want to electrify our home heating so that we can get rid of natural gas. So if you can imagine all of that going on to a single power grid, and then you look at the calamity that we saw in Texas, you have to question whether that's even possible. And there may be some places in the world where you can have reliable wind and solar year-round, regardless of what the temperature is. But when you get one of these polar vortexes that end up descending, and we get them all the time in Alberta. We used to call them the Alberta Clipper. You can see that wind and solar simply don't work. The solar panels get covered with ice and snow. The wind turbines end up getting frozen over. And then you're left with having to rely on the reliable sources for energy. What ended up happening in Texas is not only could they not rely on renewable power, but then their natural gas failed as well, and they were left in the lurch. So I think that this to me, this starts the conversation. We have to really shine the light on the fact that wind and solar may be renewable, but they're not reliable. And if we want to diversify our grid, we've got to be looking at reliability as the number one factor and truly reliable sources that can operate year-round regardless of the temperature. I know that there's outages that happen, but when you've got wind and solar that are intermittent anyway, and then they're operating at 0 or less than 30% capacity when you need it the most, it's not going to work.
So I don't know whether this is a question of policy or a question of communications, but what can Alberta and Canada learn from this debate the way you framed it right now?
Well, I think the interesting thing is, I don't know why we don't give ourselves credit for the fact that we do have a reliable as well as low greenhouse gas emitting power grid as it is. When you look at nuclear and hydropower in Ontario, hydropower in particular in Quebec, hydropower in Manitoba and British Columbia, the fact that we've got a lot of interties that have us interconnected, hydroelectric and nuclear really are a great base to build on. So what does that mean for Alberta? Alberta has problems because our grid is essentially, anytime you look at it, about 90% fossil fuels. And I think that there are some jurisdictions in Atlantic Canada that have the same. But you don't then say, okay, Alberta, your solution is only building wind turbines or only installing solar panels. We have to look at ways that we can perhaps build a cross-country transmission grid so that we can be reliably bringing in power from British Columbia and Manitoba, maybe even Ontario across the prairies. And then we also need to look at more nuclear. The small-scale nuclear, the modular nuclear seems to me to be a real opportunity. You have a number of provinces, including Ontario, Saskatchewan, New Brunswick, and Alberta, I believe, who've signed on to that. That could be a way of bringing in reliable energy as well without having a massive 10-year approval process or longer, because they're going to be building them a different way. Making sure that we understand the environmental trade-offs of hydroelectric power, but understanding that it is a green energy source. I mean, they don't consider that to be a green energy source in the U.S. And so we have to reassert that hydroelectric power is a green energy source. Hydrogen, the hydrogen economy, I think, is becoming something more and more people are talking about. That may be where wind and solar fit in, is that they need to be, if they're going to plug into the grid, they need to have a reliable backup. And whether right now their backup is natural gas, which is kind of bananas when you think about it, because they're acting as if they can replace natural gas. But the only reason you can adopt them is because you've got natural gas built into the system to work when they don't.